Hello, Namaste and welcome you all. Since our last two lectures, we have been discussing about PV ratio, which stands for profit volume ratio. But as we discussed in our last lecture, profit volume ratio is not actually the profit to sales ratio. It is actually contribution to sales ratio. That's why PV ratio is also known as contribution to sales ratio or marginal ratio or contribution ratio. PV ratio is not the ratio of profit to sales. It is the ratio of contribution to sales, as we discussed in the last lecture. Up to our last lecture, we have discussed what is PV ratio and correlationship between sales, contribution and PV ratio. Now today we are going to understand various formulas to calculate the PV ratio and variable cost ratio. Variable cost, which is also known as marginal cost. So now today we are going to understand PV ratio, formulas to calculate PV ratio, which is also known as contribution to sales ratio or contribution ratio. Means in this lecture we are going to understand the formulas available to calculate PV ratio, that is contribution to sales ratio, and variable cost ratio or marginal cost ratio. As we know, variable cost and marginal cost are one and same. So let's start. First of all, we are going to understand the formulas available to calculate the PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio or contribution ratio. So first, as the name indicates, contribution to sales ratio. Contribution to sales ratio. Contribution upon sales into 100. What contribution ratio or PV ratio tells us? As we discussed in the last lecture, suppose PV ratio is 10%, it means contribution is 10% of sales. If PV ratio is 10%, it means fixed cost is 10% of BP sales and profit is 10% of margin of safety sales, as we discussed in the last lecture. So first formula to calculate contribution to sales ratio or PV ratio is, as the name indicates, contribution to sales ratio. So contribution upon sales into 100. This is a basic formula to calculate the PV ratio. Second formula, per unit contribution upon per unit selling price into 100. First formula is in total. Total contribution upon total sales into 100. And second formula is per unit formula. Means per unit figures we take in this formula. Per unit contribution upon per unit selling price into 100. Then next formula is very simple. 100 less variable cost ratio. But while using this formula, we must have variable cost ratio. So first of all, we will have to understand what is mean by variable cost ratio. Variable cost ratio, as given here, variable cost ratio or marginal cost ratio means it is a ratio of variable cost to sales. Variable cost to sales means what it shows? It shows the percentage of variable cost to sales. Means suppose variable cost ratio is 80%. Suppose variable cost ratio is 80%. What does it mean? It means variable cost is 80% of sales. It means variable cost is 80% of sales. Suppose VC ratio or variable cost ratio or marginal cost ratio is 10%. It means variable cost is 10% of sales. If VC ratio or variable cost ratio is 90%, it means variable cost is 90% of sales. Okay. Now come to this formula. 100. Suppose sales is 100. Suppose sales is 100. Less variable cost, suppose which is 80. So remaining amount will be the amount of contribution, because as we know the contribution plus variable cost is equal to sales. Means if we deduct variable cost from sales, what will remain? Contribution will remain. Suppose sales which is 100% less, suppose sales is 100% less variable cost which is 80%. So remaining what will remain? Contribution. That contribution ratio will be 20%. Means contribution ratio means PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio. Did you understand? Suppose sales is 100% less variable cost, then what will remain? Contribution. So 100% less, suppose variable cost ratio which is 80%, so remaining 20% will be contribution ratio or contribution to sales ratio or PV ratio. Then fourth formula to calculate PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio. Change in contribution upon change in sales into 100. As we discussed in the previous lectures, that whether you take total amounts of contribution and sales or changing amounts of contribution and sales, the differential ratio between the contribution and sales will not change. That's why this formula works. These two formulas we have discussed in detail in our previous lecture. So we will directly next start our sixth formula. PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio is equal to fixed cost upon BP sales into 100. So why we have taken here fixed cost? The contribution to sales ratio means there should be contribution upon sales into 100. But as we discussed in the previous lectures, the fixed cost amount and the amount of contribution at BP level, the amount of fixed cost and the amount of contribution at BP level is always equal, as we discussed in the previous lecture. So the amount of fixed cost means the amount of contribution at BP level, means contribution at BP level at upon sales at BP level, contribution at BP level upon sales at BP level into 100. So contribution upon sales into 100, because fixed cost amount and amount of contribution at BP level is always equal. That's why this formula works. Instead of contribution at BP level, we can take fixed cost, because the amount of fixed cost is always equal to the amount of contribution at BP level, not total contribution. Contribution at BP level and the amount of total fixed cost is always equal. So instead of contribution at BP level, we can take the amount of fixed cost, because which is always equals to the amount of contribution at BP level. So contribution at BP level upon sales at BP level into 100 is equal to contribution to sales ratio or PV ratio. Same logic works at seventh formula. Profit upon margin of safety sales into 100. Profit means the amount of profit which is always equals to the amount of contribution at margin of safety level. So profit, the amount of profit and the amount of contribution at margin of safety sales level is always equal. So profit means the amount of profit is always equals to the amount of contribution of margin of safety sales level. That's why contribution at margin of safety sales level upon sales at margin of safety sales level. So contribution upon sales at margin of safety sales level. Contribution at margin of safety sales level upon sales at margin of safety level into 100 is equal to contribution to sales ratio or PV ratio. By using these 7 formulas, we can calculate the PV ratio. Now we are going to understand the formulas available to calculate the variable cost ratio or marginal cost ratio. As we discuss, variable cost ratio means the variable cost ratio means ratio of variable cost to sales. Variable cost to sales. What it shows? It shows the percentage of variable cost to sales. Suppose variable cost is 80, sales is 100, then ratio will be 80%. Variable cost ratio or marginal cost ratio is 80%. It means variable cost is 80% of sales. You can see 80 is 80% of 100. So second formula, in first formula we take total amounts. In second formula we can take per unit amount. So per unit variable cost upon per unit selling price. Variable cost, selling price. Variable cost, sales into 100. So variable cost ratio or marginal cost ratio shows percentage of variable cost to sales. Suppose variable cost or marginal cost ratio is 80%. It means variable cost is 80% of sales. If VC ratio or variable cost ratio is 10%, it means variable cost is 10% of sales. Then next formula to calculate the variable cost ratio or marginal cost ratio. 100 less PV ratio. PV ratio means which ratio? Contribution ratio. Suppose sales is 100. Suppose sales is 100. Less contribution which is 20. So what will remain? Variable cost. That will be 80. Okay. Because why? Contribution plus variable cost is equal to sales. That's why it happens. So sales suppose 100%. Less PV ratio suppose which is 20%. So less 20%. So remaining variable cost ratio will be 80%. Why it happens? Because contribution plus variable cost is equal to 100. You can see here PV ratio. Suppose here contribution ratio which is 20% plus variable cost ratio which is 80%. So 100% will be the sales. Means these are compare with sales amount. Both figures, variable cost and contribution, is compare with the sales. It shows relation with the sales. Means what we can see, suppose sales is 100, less variable cost is equal to PV ratio. Sales less PV ratio is equal to variable cost ratio. You can see sales less variable cost is equal to PV ratio. Sales less variable cost ratio is equal to PV ratio. Here sales less PV ratio is equal to variable cost ratio. So I hope all of you understood it. Thank you.